As I promised, we are going to begin, and the way we're going to begin is with this panel discussion. And we're going to get you involved very shortly in this discussion. But before we do, what I'd like to do is I'd like to introduce to you the panelists who are joining us. And I'm going to move around here. I'm not going to actually sit on the panel because I'm not worthy. It's such a great panel. So here we have Dr. Paula Harrell, who is is a Japan-China historian at Georgetown University. Beside her is Sheila Smith, who's the senior fellow for Japan at the Council on Foreign Relations. Beside Sheila is Ambassador Chaz Freeman, who's chairman of the board of Projects International, distinguished diplomat. Beside Chaz is Meg Lunsiger, the public policy fellow at the Wilson Center. And besides Meg is Dr. Kuniko Ashizawa, who's an adjunct professor at the School of International Service at American University. This is a wonderful panel capable of carrying us through both the issues of economic policy and security policy that we want to discuss. But as I promised, I'd like to get all of you involved, and I'd like to give you and the panel a glimpse into what they're thinking. So the first thing we do is I'd like to go and ask 5 or 6 questions on sort of framing questions. And this will take very quickly, because the way it works is a question will come up on the screen. If we could put a question up on the screen. And when the question comes up on the screen, which should happen when I say that 4 or 5 times, and put up the first question. And you'll say that it says, what is your view of overall relations between the Obama and Abe administrations? A, bilateral relations have progressed significantly. B, relations have progressed slightly. C, relations have regressed. D, not much change. Or E, not sure. Then you can pick up the little blue device in front of you, and you can hit A, B, C, D, or E, and their vote will take 8 seconds. You see the counting down. And all you do by voting is you just press the button. And it counts down, and we get a total here. So 48% of you say bilateral relations have progressed significantly, and 33% say relations have progressed slightly. 0% say relations have regressed. So all of you from the Japanese government, the US government, congratulations. Things are heading in the right direction. And we can all go home now. All right, so let's go to the next question. These are 3 framing questions, and then there are 4 economic questions. In which area do you want to see closer cooperation between the US and Japan? Trade and investment, military cooperation and regional security, energy and environment, international development and human rights, or other? Now, I warn you as you are voting, if you click other, I'm going to ask you who you are, and you will have to say what you mean. Okay, now I'm not trying to scare you away. I want to encourage people to say other. But the leading answer is military cooperation and regional security. And I think that's quite interesting, and I think that'll be an interesting subject for the panel to discuss. With the second answer being trade and investment. Somebody said other. Now, there's small electrodes placed on your chair, so we can find out who it was. Who said other? Oh, I could have bet any amount of money. If Clyde Prestowitz is in the room, he said other.
It was me, David. Yeah, because I think that trade and investment, we just signed a deal, so I don't see that there's a great more to do there. Military cooperation and regional security, it's also pretty ho-hum. Energy and environment, I think the real question is this: where are Japan and the United States going to be in the year 2050? Where's Japan going to be in the year 2050? Do we assume that the 7th Fleet is going to be in Yokosuka in 2050? Do we assume that the Pacific is going to look like it does now? I think that kind of looking ahead is something that the U.S. and Japan ought to be doing.
Japan, they ought to be doing long-term planning together. Next.
I'm Ben Self from the Mansfield Foundation. I initially thought all of the above, but that's not a choice. Gender equality. We've already seen Michelle Obama and Akie Abe join together to promote girls' education globally. But the status of women in Japan still needs a lot of work, and we should work together with the Japanese to help them develop this kind of panel where we have a lot of women explaining things.
What I was trying to point out here is Chaz is outnumbered. And by the way, this is something we try to do at Foreign Policy on all of our panels. We do not do panels unless they have gender balance. Thank you very much. Did you say other? I don't believe you. So we'll come to a question later. Next.
Next question.
It's not that you don't look trustworthy. I just think there were only two. Chinese President Xi's visit to the U.S. was a success for A, China, B, the U.S., C, both countries, D, neither country, or E, other. We're going to motor through 4 economic questions, then we're going to get to the panel. But this will give the panel some idea of where you all stand. And so, interestingly, 33% of you say China, 4% say the U.S., C say both, only 16% say both countries, and 42%, the leading answer, says neither country, and somebody said other, which I'm not even sure metaphysically how that's possible, but who said other? It was just a clamoring for attention here. Do you feel neglected already in the course of this event?
I think the Pope won that weekend.
Okay. So the President of the U.S. and China meet, the Pope wins. Next. Let's go to economics. Do you agree that further economic cooperation between the U.S. and Japan, such as TPP, helps provide a strong economic counter to China's influence? Agree, neither agree nor disagree, disagree, or unsure? And we will have a debate over the difference between B and D in a second. Okay, 70% of you say it provides a strong economic counter to China's influence. Something else for the panel to discuss. Next, 3 more of these. What country region do you think is most likely to join, should be included in the next round of TPP? A, South Korea, B, China, C, Taiwan, D, Indonesia, E, Thailand, or F, other. And your conclusion is 60% of you are correct. 60% of you are right because it will be Korea. Next. Which area represents the greatest opportunity for energy cooperation between Japan and the U.S.? A, civil nuclear cooperation, B, renewable energy, C, natural gas supply agreements, or D, other. And then there's just one more, and then I'm going to come to you, panel. The first thing I'm going to ask is what among these questions surprised you or you found interesting. 43% say natural gas supply agreements, and the crowd's getting a little shy here. Nobody said other. And the final of the energy questions, and then we'll have a few more a little later on security, but the final one of the economic questions is, should the U.S. lift the ban on crude oil exports? A, yes, completely, I assume that means, or B, partially, or C, no? And the answer is 70% of you will be happy because I am sure that will happen. I'm here to answer all your questions, even if there's doubt elsewhere in Washington. We're going to cut to the chase. So, Sheila, you listened, you looked,
I did.
you watched. What was
did.
your reaction?
You know, I was going yes, 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 almost all the way through until we, I was a little surprised actually by the area in which the U.S. and Japan should expand their cooperation. To be quite frank with you, I thought this week's TPP agreement meant that people would be talking a little bit more about trade and the economy than they would be talking about military and security. I think personally, I feel that our military security relationship is actually very, very close. There's lots we can continue to do, but I don't have much doubt at all that the U.S. and Japan can move the military side of the relationship forward. But I think the trade and economic side deserves a lot of our attention and support.
Paula.
I I was surprised by the fact that there were no questions about China and Japan. It was about Xi Jinping's visit to the U.S. and whether China would be one of the likely countries to sign up for the TPP and so on, but nothing on the China-Japan.
What's the question you wish we would ask?
The question I wish you would ask would be what people thought the future of that relationship would be. Would Abe and Xi meet, say, this coming November? These, I think, are really critical
And what is
questions.
the answer to that question?
What would be the answer to that question?
Yes.
I'm optimistic
Okay.
because I think there are a lot of indicators, and starting with the APEC icy handshake, but moving on from there, that things are moving in that direction. And there's every reason and hope, certainly, that this will happen. I think they have both the capacity and there is a desirability for China and Japan to improve the relationship, at least to get it back to the agreement in 2008.
So from your perspective, when you see an icy handshake, the focus is on the handshake and not on the
The
icy.
focus is on the handshake, and the focus really should be not on the handshake, but on what other underpinnings there are to the relationship. So
Right,
I think
okay.
those would be interesting.
Chaz, what struck you from this?
Well, what struck me was what I think is a case of wishful thinking about TPP somehow countering Chinese economic influence in Asia. I think that's nonsense. It's everybody's biggest trading partner. It and India are outside TPP at the present time. And the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, is going forward. I don't think we're going to write the rules, and I understand that as a talking point for selling TPP in Washington, but I don't think it's correct. The second thing that surprised me was the emphasis on the military relationship. Not because we don't have things to do, we have a lot of things to do. The post-war order is over. We destroyed Japanese hegemony during that war and replaced it with our own. The post-Cold War era is now over. China's back as growing in wealth and power. We have a different position from Japan on a number of issues in the region, including the Senkakus. We're quite close, but not exactly together. And Japan has a real justification for building its own military capabilities. I think it's doing that, and I think we need to adjust the relationship to acknowledge that Japan now needs to play a regional role in balance in association with us. We need to redefine the relationship. It should not be a protectorate anymore. It should be an alliance of equals.
An alliance of equals, a theme we will return to, I suspect, as we go forward. Kuniko, let me go to you next. As you saw the answers, what struck you?
Of course, I was glad to see that most of the people think that the U.S.-Japan relationship has been doing well. I mean, particularly the bilateral relationship has been good. But I want to add a little bit caveat for this because I spent 2 months in Japan in this summer, and then there's a kind of increasing kind of demonstration among young Japanese students, and joined by the many other kind of different status of the society, and then they are primarily against the Japanese, basically the introduction of the new security legislation, and which was, I think, part of the kind of important kind of democratic exercise in Japanese society. But the discourse within this kind of anti-security legislation demonstration was really kind of framed in anti-American, or somehow kind of they were kind of pointing out it was the United States which told the Japanese government to introduce this security bill. And that really concerned me, because concerned me in like a more grassroots relationship between Japan and the United States. And then whether this kind of new movement or kind of grassroots movement may grow substantially in the Japanese society or Japanese politics, which is not known yet. But there may be the kind of important ingredients that we need to think about between U.S.-Japan relationship. And then one more thing about the cooperation between the area for the cooperation between Japan and the United States. I was also kind of struck by this. The security area was chosen by many people, and I was wondering, what does it mean about security cooperation? between US and Japan in Asia Pacific? Is it going to be more kind of explicitly the security cooperation vis-a-vis China or something else? And then I would like to move the US-Japan kind of cooperation in the security, regional security arena to probably building more kind of inclusive multilateral security, some kind of mechanism in the region.
Well, those are 2 points that I'd like to come back to. One being the bigger point of this event, which is what kind of architecture are we looking for in the region? Because while there is a transatlantic architecture, and while that architecture may be antiquated, it's still there, it's still clear, and there's even a next move forward with it with TTIP. But in the Asia-Pacific region, or as the Australians refer to it, the Indo-Pacific region, to define it even more broadly, we're missing an architecture, and I think that's something we want to come to. We also want to talk a little bit about the security issues, but before we do, I want to turn to you, Meg, and sort of get your reaction to the reactions.
Well, I had when I looked at the choices, I said, oh, I really personally would like to see more in the security area. And maybe that's because in the economics area, I do see a lot of cooperation. With TPP, that's naturally going to happen, so it's not that I feel it needs an additional effort. It will be an effort on the part of both countries to adjust to, and of course all the countries in the TPP to adjust as they make their commitments, and hopefully it comes into force. But on the security side, I think it's more of what Chaz was saying, in terms of being a partnership, in terms of being more, more of a sense of, we're all interested in having a stable, peaceful region, and that's going to take all countries being involved. I don't see it so much as wanting to encircle China, because when I look at China, I see China's being more brought into the norms of behavior in the rest of the world. And admittedly, I'm looking at this on the economic side, but they're taking a lot of steps to become more like the rest of us on the economic side. So I'm hoping that might translate. And I think having a renewed, strong relationship with Japan will help bring some of those modes of behavior sort of a little bit more broadly to the region.
Okay, good. Now I'm going to come back with another round of questions, and after I do a round of questions, I'm going to ask you for questions. We'll finish up the economic side, and then we will move on to the security side. I do want to point out that you see some of the Twitter activity over here that the ambassador said would have made his colleagues so uncomfortable. I'm glad he's comfortable with it. And you can see it's going out, including those red FPs. Mr. Ambassador, I don't mean, since you are our co-host here, I don't mean to make you uncomfortable, but we have almost 700,000 followers, which is, inappropriate since we're much smaller than Japan. But we are considerably smaller than Justin Bieber, if that's any consolation. We've arranged the meetings that we do very carefully. We did one on economic and trade issues, and TPA passed the day of the meeting, so we had something to discuss. We had this Pacific meeting coming up, and so we arranged to have TPP all get done right before this meeting. No, don't mention it. And but let me ask you a couple of quick questions on this. I'll ask you, Sheila, but anybody jump in with any answers, and let's try to keep the responses sort of crisp on this. Is TPP overstated? I mean, first of all, I'm seeing all these statements, and it's like, this is the biggest agreement in 20 years. Well, of course it is. There hasn't been an agreement in 20 years. And secondly, this agreement brings together 40% of the global production. Well, the US and Japan bring together 30% of global production. So that essentially means that 75% of what we're talking about here is just two countries, and the rest of the countries aren't even that significant. There's only one other that's got, I think, over $1 trillion, or maybe two others, in terms of GDP. Is this a big deal in some way, or is this just, we've been crossing the desert and it's the first drop of water we've seen on the trade front for a while?
No, I'll jump in. I think it is a big deal. And what impressed me is the diversity of the countries that were part of this. You have Vietnam in there, Malaysia. We don't think of Malaysia as a traditional close partner of the US on a lot of these sorts of issues. And getting Japan into an agreement like this, I think that's tremendous. What it'll produce immediately, well, time will tell, because it's always unclear as tariffs get reduced. I mean, this is the potential for the US. but also as there are going to be changes domestically in a lot of countries to adjust to this. And I think that's the opportunity for the US, because we've got a lot of dynamism here, a lot of innovation, and I think it's a real opportunity to become anchored in a part of the world that's going to be the most rapidly growing. I mean, we're not going to see Europe growing rapidly. We're not going to see Latin America, I think, picking up. And so it's really going to be Asia. So hopefully, at some point, we could get countries like Indonesia in, some of the others. Korea, certainly. I think, I mean, they tried at the last minute, but I think there'd be a real benefit to having Korea in it as well.
Okay, well, my fine-tuned moderator antennae saw that Chaz sort of shifted in his seat a little bit when I said, is it a big deal? And you said it's a big deal. So I'm sensing that you maybe didn't think, you think it's been a little hype, but maybe I'm wrong.
I think it has been hyped. I think it is, Japan and the US are the arch, the keystones in this arch. It began with a small group of countries, and we basically took over the negotiation. And it was very important for political reasons that we reach agreement between Tokyo and Washington, and we've done that. But I don't notice that either Japan or the United States really gave very much or got very much in this agreement. And the economic impact of it remains to be proven, and I think that will be extensively examined in the Congress as we go forward with the debate. This is not yet a done deal.
Let me say three things I think, David, are important. One is starting off where Chaz left off was, is TPP good for Japan? And I think it's very clear that the Japanese government has prepared itself for full participation in TPP. And whether it's agricultural reform or other kinds of reforms, I think this is the leverage that the Abe cabinet sees for its own broader aspirations for Abenomics. So it's good for Japan, I would say. The ambassador may disagree with me, but I think he probably wouldn't. But on US-Japan, I think it's great. The US and Japan have, for many years, talked about an economic partnership agreement, but we've never gotten to the table on it. So TPP is very good for the bilateral economic relationship between the United States and Japan. And I think the thing that we forget often is that TPP, yes, it's an instrument of the rebalance, and I think it ought to be for the United States, but it's also good for global trade liberalization. And again, we can have a very hearty debate in this group about whether that aspiration of trade liberalization is good or bad for the global economy. I happen to think it's good. And we have international trade regimes that have stalled, frankly, on that. And I think TPP has some real promise. It has to be completed. The Congress has to approve it. We're not there yet, but I think there's all kinds of reasons to think that this is a positive step forward.
I'll go to Paul and then Kuniko.
I think it has promise in the sense that the focus of the discussion tonight is new architecture in the Asia Pacific. And you think of the cluster of organizations that China is now, or the initiatives that China is now launching, the AIIB, the SCO, RECEP, and other organizations. This is kind of a balancer, I think, to those efforts. And I think the Chinese may want to join and so on. I think it establishes a real integration of countries in Asia on a number of different levels.
Kuniko.
I think I agree with Chase in terms of economic benefit for each country. I mean, say that member state, it may not be so big deal because there are so many uncertainties. I mean, what exactly that would bring, the agreement would bring to each country economically. But in terms of from Japanese perspective, I agree with Sheila that it's really important for Abe administration that they can use this as a kind of really important kickstart for their kind of long-awaited kind of more like a strategic structural reform with the kind of domestic economic institutions. So they can use this as a really key important kickstart for their continuous Abenomics agenda. But also, I have been examining the U.S. foreign policy vis-a-vis Asia-Pacific regional institution building. And from that perspective, again, it's really big deal for the U.S. foreign policy vis-a-vis Asia, because U.S. has been historically more reluctant to get really seriously engaged in the regional institution building or taking initiative for the regional institution building. But this TPP, the U.S. government really committed, and they kind of showed that U.S. would kind of lead the rule-making in East Asia and kind of this multilateral forum. Although it's not the entirely multilateral forum, but still it's a new regional grouping. But that would kind of send really important message vis-a-vis other Asian countries. and then also including China.
Well, it might, but there's a way that it might send a not good message, and I want to challenge it, and then we'll go it up. And the way it wouldn't is if the premise that people are offering doesn't actually work. The premise, to a large extent, is this is going to change China. But if China is the dog and TPP is the tail, then, and China doesn't go along, and China has its own trade strategy in the region, and it's trying to set up its own deal, and at the end of the day, China changes TPP more than TPP changes China, then it's going to send a big message about what the future of the architecture in the region is going to be. Sheila, agree?
Just a comment, I agree with you. I think one of the things that's attractive about TPP is the fact that it is a high standards agreement, right? It has some basic understandings of labor laws, protections, right? It has some basic understandings of environmental law and regulation and protections. And that is really going to be the hurdle that we're going to have to evaluate whether or not China wants to come in, or whether it wants to transform itself and so that it can come in. And I think there's a mistake here to see TPP as just a leverage point against China. It's not. It's a fairly significant economic initiative that we should take on its own merits. Whether China comes or goes, we'll see, I think.
Ches, you know China as well as anybody I know. When you talk about China wanting to transform itself, it seems to me China always wants to advance its self-interest. If that involves transformation, great. If it doesn't involve transformation, it's not important. Isn't that really the central issue here?
China will look at TPP from the point of view of leveraging Gaetsu, foreign pressure, for the advantage of domestic reform. But it has two major agendas that completely outflank TPP. One is the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which is going forward in the region as we conceive it. And the second is One Belt, One Road, which is a $1.4 trillion effort to integrate the entire Eurasian landmass in such a way that the dynamism and size of the Chinese economy can have full play everywhere from Portugal to Russian maritime provinces. And I don't think TPP addresses either of these strategies.
And we're going to come back to it, and maybe Admiral Blair will talk a little bit about it later, because the question is also whether the US has a strategy or whether we have a strategy with our allies. And you might say, and Denny knows this from his days at PACOM as well as subsequent to that, the US has always had something of an involvement in the belt side of it, in other words, the ocean side of it. But in terms of One Road, we're not playing in that game in Central Asia, and that is a place where we may see it as potential weakness. Do we have one or two quick questions for the panel on an economic issue? Quick questions before we move on to the security questions. Quick question.
Just a real quick question. Do you think do you think if you asked what is the most important issue, and you compare that military or economic in New York City to Wall Street, that you'd get the same answer?
I could jump in on that, because CFR has an office in New York. I would suggest no, you would not get the same answer. And I think that was surprising to me. It sounded to me like a Washington response, which is not bad or good, but it is a different response. And we're used to thinking of the alliance largely in terms of our military engagement. And that military engagement is absolutely essential for both of us. But I think the reality is we need the trade and investment piece to follow suit. And the United States, I think, needs to lead on that with Japan in the region, but also the energy piece. I mean, there's a lot of pieces here where there's opportunity for the United States and for Japan, but for the region as well.
By the way, there's a little something built in. It's not just New York versus Washington. Yeah. There's something built in which I would call sort of specialist bias, which is if you get a room full of specialists together, they'll talk about the arcane thing that they've all been talking about, like Japan's changing military stance, which broader group might not be talking about, and that changes the balance. Chaz, and then we're going to go to security questions.
The reason we need to spend more time thinking about and engaging with Asia is because it's the economic center of gravity on the planet now. It's not because of its military weight. And the challenge that China's rise presents is primarily economic. I would be more convinced of TPP than I am if I saw that it clearly increased our competitive advantages internationally or created jobs in key industries. Here, I don't see that. And I think, therefore, it's a false dichotomy in a sense, but to pick up Sheila's point, this is the home of the military-industrial complex, right here.
Not on this panel.
And not on this panel. But therefore, if you ask this question in Washington, you will get a heavy bias toward the military answer. And I think it's important, but it is not the most important issue that we face.
What do you want to ask?
Oh, no, I just asked whether, because I heard we were doing security next, whether we were going to get back to the gender issue.
What do you want to do on gender?
I think it's a huge issue. I really want to thank Professor Ashizawa for her bringing to light this issue that there are a lot of people in Japan who are active in their frustration with the direction that the Abe government is taking things, and there is I, as someone who cares about the U.S.-Japan relationship, would not like to see that translated into anti-Americanism. It connects with the gender issue because so many people in that area, in that field, are women. My question was going to be about gender. I would like the panel to sort of address how they sense this issue of women in the workforce playing out. You have feminists in Japan who are accusing the Abe administration of the instrumentalization of women, that women's in the workforce is not about what's good for women, it's about what's good for the economy. Obviously, there's an overlap there. And then there are others who are accusing the Abe administration of taking Japan in a direction that is not Japanese.
Okay, brief answer. It's a huge issue, and a brief answer.
I have been kind of observing that the Japanese domestic discourse on this gender issue, and even some feminists really kind of a little bit ambivalent what Abe administration has been promoting as under the banner of the womenomics. But there is both like a positive and also kind of a little bit concerned factors with the current womenomics. One positive thing is, of course, the gender issue now really came into the center of the political discourse. I mean, one of the center, the main issue of the Japanese political discourse, and also the general conversation in the various offices, so which I believe this is still from the Japanese point of view is a major progress. But the language which the government has been using also carefully is still, it's a more kind of idea to utilize the women's labor force for the beefing up the Japanese economy, and it's not necessarily kind of targeting on the women's rights issue or the question of more like gender equality. So that indeed concerned some of the Japanese, particularly female workers, and also those who are at home. So it's, I think, still a work in progress. And then, but again, if I just kind of try to a little bit point out the positive things, is now the finally kind of discourses started. In terms of the number of the women's representation in Japan, still it's not that fabulous. And then even the Abe administration just formed a new cabinet. And then the number of the women, the female ministers, cabinet members, indeed down from 6 to 3. So still, it's kind of a way to see the situation.
Well, good. You know, we have always good news, bad news story in the U.S. The good news story is you might have the next president of the United States a woman. The bad news story is she came out against TPP 2 hours ago. But we'll discuss that in a moment. Let's go to a couple of quick questions on security. And we'll go through these very quickly. There are only, I think, 4 questions. The biggest threat to U.S. and Japanese interests by China's unchecked territorial opportunism in the South and East China Seas is A, there's no real risk, rather intimidation, B, loss of access to sea lanes and airspace, C, disruption of trade and supply routes, D, a potential for military conflict and regional instability, or E, other. We've got about 10 minutes left in this session, so We'll go from these to questions, and I'm going to ask you the same question again as the reaction. So D, of course, is the one that is on people's minds, the potential for military conflict and regional instability. Who said other, and why did you say it? Just shout it out, yeah. Briefly, very briefly.
I think that a serious concern is the risk of miscalculation and the unleashing of some very nasty nationalist sentiments within China, and what that might be able to do if it gets out of the regime's control to hijack their broader military strategy, if they get forced into doing something that they might not really want to do.
Okay, thanks. Next question. To counteract China's further territorial opportunism and minimize the risk of military conflict in the South and East China Seas, the U.S. should A, rely on adherence to the Convention of the Law of the Sea and freedom of navigation, B, threaten military action to thwart additional land grabs, demarcations, and island building in defense of allies in the region, C, engage in sovereignty disputes in support of allies, D, monitor activity and limit engagement, E, strengthen economic and diplomatic ties in the region, or F, other. So the leading answer is strengthening economic and diplomatic ties, which seems to be a path we are on here, with a focus on relying on adherence to the Convention of the Law of the Sea as the next biggest. There were a bunch of you who said other. Who has a really strong answer? Since we don't have time to go to a bunch of you, but like, who's really smart and said other? Okay. Yeah.
The others have gotten very shy.
Okay, well, what do we have? 2 more? So let's go. What will be the biggest impact of Japan's latest shift in military policy to allow for greater international engagement? A, it helps contain China's rising power in the region. B, it adds to political and military tensions in the region. C, it facilitates closer US-Japan military cooperation. D, Japan will play a much greater role in global affairs and multilateral engagements such as UN peacekeeping operations. E, we're unlikely to see a real difference. Or F, not sure. Not sure being the least likely answer to get in Washington, even when no one is sure. And as you see, not sure finished last. 44% of you said it facilitates closer US-Japan military cooperation, which is also a bit of a narcissistic US answer. We see other countries always do things in a way that refers to the US, right, as opposed to their own national interest. And D, Japan will play a much greater role in global affairs and multilateral engagement. So, one more question? Will China abide by the new US-China cybersecurity agreement?
Will we?
There you go, there's a question.
Okay.
Or I don't know, or I have no clue, or did we actually?
And
did we expect anything else?
96% of you say no. 4% of you have had too much wine. Chaz, react to some of this.
The most striking thing, actually, not a surprise, I think, is the absence of any diplomatic approach whatsoever to the resolution of territorial disputes in the region. Everybody's thinking in military terms: deter, freeze the situation, contain the risk, don't solve it. Now, that is really a remarkable Washington answer. As I say, very consistent with military-industrial thinking here, but really very, very unusual in the international context. Usually, when there are problems that risk war, people try to solve them. We try to freeze them. That's unusual. I would say also that the response to what the new Japanese security legislation offers is correct, that it does offer the opportunity of greater coordination between the US and Japan. And inasmuch as It is absolutely preposterous to imagine that the United States can indefinitely dominate the near seas off China's coast as it modernizes, any more than they can dominate our coastlines. We need help from countries in the region, and any balance that is going to be constructed has to be built on the basis of strength in the region by the countries in the region, with Japan as the main element. Japan is going to have to become more responsible for its own defense, more responsible for regional activity, and the United States, as I said, is going to have to move away from regarding Japan as a protectorate and toward treating Japan as an equal ally.
Okay, very important point. Okay,
Can I
Sheila,
jump in
I'm going to
just-
go to each of you to respond to this. We're coming towards the end of the panel, so
I'll try
you've
to
got to
be-
wrap up points.
I'll try to
making
be brief. So I think one of the key issues that's currently being discussed between the U.S. and Chinese government, as well as the Japanese and Chinese government, is risk reduction agreement. So that's the first step. We don't want an incident in the East China Sea, and for that matter in the South China Sea, that's going to potentially escalate into a situation where the militaries will be involved. So risk reduction, I think, is a short-term response. The long-term solution of the problem, of course, takes some diplomatic effort, and until Beijing is ready to engage in that diplomatic effort, I think we have to work on larger regime building in the region. I think the U.S. has a critical role to play, not simply a military role, but I think it ought to take seriously the fact that some of its key allies feel anxious about what's going on in the maritime region around them and what that means for their long-term security. So of course we work closely with our allies. But the broader collective action I think we need to see in the region is the United States, Japan, the ASEAN countries, and Beijing coming together to figure out what the norms and the rules are going to be, especially in the maritime sphere, but in other spheres as well. So I think it's a multi-layered approach. It's a short-term and a long-term approach, but we can't do it without China. We need to be able to have this conversation with China until the anxiety in the region steadily reduces a little bit.
Let me ask the three remaining panelists to consider one other thing, which is we're here to talk about architecture. And we've got fragments of architecture in the region, whether it's TPP or it's ASEAN or it's other partnerships or it's bilateral. We clearly don't have an architecture that reflects the new economic and security dynamics in the region. What do we need? What do we need in terms of regional architecture? Where would you go post-TPP?
Well, post-TPP, I think for a lot of the international financial economic architecture, I think it's important to keep it anchored in a multilateral system, not just a regional system. So to have countries working through the IMF in terms of how they handle financial flows, exchange rate policies, those sorts of things, and having deeper trade relations, both across the board, trade and investment relations, I think will help promote that integration and a bit more of that trust across countries. But I do think keeping it multilateral, not just regional, for setting a lot of these standards is important. And as I said earlier, I think a lot of this engagement is bringing China to be more like us. I know there are problems in different areas, but a lot of the behavior is changing, reflecting what global norms are. And I think having deep relationships with Japan helps us maintain those kinds of standards globally.
Okay, Paul.
Well, certainly China talks about a rules-based order on its own, and whether they need to become more like us or we simply need to talk about what the rules are. Yeah. There are big questions, for example, about sovereignty and also internet sovereignty, where there are different points of view, and that comes up in this cybersecurity question, I think. Will they abide by an agreement? Well, publicly at least, there has been the issue aired of an agreement that is needed. And I think beyond that, you have to start talking about what the rules would be. In the case of the Diaoyuan or in the Senkaku Islands, as Jerome Cohen said, it's a whole lot better to have lawfare rather than warfare. And I think, again, that kind of dialogue that is multilateral is very healthy and necessary, but perhaps we're leading from the wrong assumption, in a sense, that they should become like us. Well, maybe there are some areas where a different set of rules is called for or will happen. And of course, we see this in the other part of the architecture, the AIIB, the RCEP, and the SCO, and so on, the other agreements that China is trying to put together. with countries in the region. So I think there's a lot of wait and see because we aren't sure, but there should be a lot of multilateral dialogue on all of these questions.
Okay, I'm going to go to Chaz, and then I'm going to go to Kuniko, and you're going to have the last word here.
It would help if we would ratify the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea rather than talking about it and not making it the law of the land. If we're going to try to enforce a rule-bound order, which I think we should do, we ought to be bound by the rules, and we ought to accept them ourselves.
Very novel notion for Washington.
I can be a little bit maybe controversial and maybe counterintuitive to my American audience here, but I think one of the missing point and element of the regional architecture is a more viable and strong kind of cooperative mechanism within Northeast Asia. That means between Japan and China and South Korea. And then because Southeast Asian countries do have a quite substantive regional mechanism, whereas that kind of things are really missing in Northeast Asia. And then those three countries are really major kind of actors in East Asian or Asia Pacific region. So I think this is a time to a little bit more seriously to think about Northeast Asia, this kind of trilateral the grouping, and to be a little bit more substantive. And then question is how the United States would support that kind of initiative, regional group making.
Did you want to add one last thing? Go ahead, Paul.
I just wanted to say one more thing. Some of those mechanisms actually exist. The trilateral, China, Japan, Korea trilateral cooperation secretariat, for example. And I think as the U.S. needs to encourage those organizations in the work they're already doing. And I think often these kinds of things are overlooked in the discourse here. They're kind of lost in dispute news, and I think the media really has a role to play in trying to bring out the work that's already being done by some of these organizations.
And by the way, I think that's a point that we ought to take away from this, because there are some pieces of architecture that exist that have atrophied for one reason or another that are being revitalized. So the Australians, for example, have pushed the Indian Ocean Rim discussion, and for the first time, U.S. sent Tom Shannon, a very senior official, to that meeting, and it's like, well, can that work? What can we use that's there and piece it together? Ladies and gentlemen, here's what's going to happen at this point. We are going to take 5 to 7 minutes. I've told 5 to 7 minutes to clear your plates and to put a dessert in front of you. And then we're going to continue with more really, really interesting conversation. There'll be more chance for your questions if you didn't get them in now. First, I'll start with Stefan Seelig, who will explain to us Hillary Clinton's position on TPP. No, it's just to block the exits, please. And then we will go to Admiral Blair for a very strong finish and an important look at tying together all of these issues. But there will be a 5 to 7 minute break. Don't go anywhere. Talk to each other. You may have seen in the Twitter feed there, down at the bottom in the middle, it's Putin's 63rd birthday. Clearly, he's gotten a lot of things for himself recently. You may want to talk around the table. What should you get the man who has almost everything? So you can talk about Putin's birthday present. Something for 5 to 7 minutes. But before you do, please join me in thanking this panel for a terrific job in getting us started.
Maybe I can use for my teaching.
That's why he kept saying, Sheila.
Okay, yeah.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, I promised you that we were going to have a full evening, and we are going to have a full evening. So if I could have your attention, please. If I could have your attention, please, and turn away from your great desserts and your great dinner partners. You know, we are extremely fortunate tonight to have such a remarkably distinguished group of people to discuss the issues at play here. Especially in this moment where TPP is right at the center of everybody's attention, to have Undersecretary Stefan Seelig here from the Commerce Department, who runs the International Trade Administration, which, based on my own experience in government, is the most important part of the United States government.
My mother agrees with you, David.
Yeah, his mother, and because that's where I work for the U.S. government. But Stefan brings terrific experience to the job, having been a leading figure in the financial community before coming into the government and embarking on this period of public service to work with Penny Pritzker, who is, I think, perhaps the most successful Commerce Secretary in recent memory. Activist, engaged, and I will tell you, and we'll talk about it a little bit, but in recently talking to her about TPP, she was doing something that almost no senior government official has done with regard to any trade deal that I have remember, which was she was talking about how are we going to make the trade deal work. The typical impulse in the US government is to do a deal and then say, what's the next deal? And to move on from negotiation to negotiation. And she's already got a plan, and I know that Stefan's been in the middle of that plan, to go and try and lay the groundwork to actually get trade out of it, create jobs out of it, and so forth. But before we turn to that, I think it would be very useful for you to offer for everybody here the administration's framework on where we go from here with TPP. What's the timeline? What needs to happen, and when do you think things will happen?
Well, first of all, David, thank you for inviting me to join you tonight. I'm not sure I would have accepted if I would have known that somebody smarter than me was hosting me, and an ambassador that is more charming and funnier than I am was introducing me, and panelists that were much more knowledgeable than I am. But here I am, and thank God I'm the best-looking guy you invited.
I don't know.
Thank you
First
for
of
that.
all, I'm sure Denny and Chaz do not.
Look, I mean, this was the first step in the process, which was getting the agreement signed Monday morning in Atlanta. And obviously now we have a congressional process to get through, which provides for 90 days of review, as you know, which will take us, at the best case, into early next year before it could possibly be voted on. And during that period of time, you know, the administration has been cleared, and this was all memorialized in the TPA agreement that was finalized this summer, that there is going to be an active dialogue and opportunity for all of the thought leaders and government officials to review the final text, which, by the way, I will add is not out yet, and to comment on it. So that is the process. You mentioned what Penny and I are doing in the context of our work. I would say today, this afternoon, I have about 2,100 people that work for me in 75 plus countries around the world and over 100 cities in the United States. And we got on the phone with all of them to talk about how they should be being ambassadors for TPP, to talk about the benefits for American companies, and American workers, and American jobs, and higher paying jobs, in our view, that will come from the successful enactment of TPP. So that's the process we're going through. There's going to be an education process, and there's going to be a discussion process.
So in terms of the timeline, and I know you don't want to get into the business really of exactly predicting political timelines, but if you look out past the 90 days, that puts you into January and February,
Yes.
which is primary season. And right now, the leading Democratic candidate for president, Hillary Clinton, has said she opposed the deal, although I will say as a footnote that what she said was she supported the deal in principle, but she had a very high standard for the deal, and that as she understood the deal currently, it didn't meet that standard. And this language is very reminiscent because many, many years ago, like the Hoover administration, well, actually, no, it was the first Clinton administration when I was doing a similar job. In '92, Bill Clinton took the same position towards NAFTA. It was a very, very similar position. And later, the position evolved. But in any event, Hillary Clinton has taken this position. Bernie Sanders has taken this position. Martin O'Malley has taken this position. So the three contenders, leading contenders on the Democratic side, have taken a position opposite the president's. And the leading contender on the Republican side, paradoxically, you wouldn't expect that, Donald Trump, has taken a position against this.
Yep.
So it seems unlikely that something's going to happen in January or February in that fraught atmosphere. And there's some people who think this may actually slide through the year into the lame duck session at the end of the year where it's kind of, there's political cover. And I was just wondering, do you give credence to those views? Is the administration going to push for it early? What do you think is going to happen?
Well, I'd say a couple of things. One is I think some of these comments are premature and unfortunate because, in fact, the text has not been released. And if you're not a senior government official or a negotiator, you haven't seen it. So it's really hard to be have an informed view, I think, at the moment. As you said, look, I was in the private sector for almost 30 years, and I've been here for 17 or 18 months.
You're
so
amazingly well preserved.
Yeah, thank you. I had a big bushy head of hair 17 months ago. I would say that I'm the last person you should ask about understanding the political timetable of all this. But at the end of the day, I think the question is going to be and should be, is this the right deal for the American people? And at least from my perspective, I think the conclusion is so overwhelmingly yes. I think Chaz was in a bad mood today, so he was a little bit more circumspect about TPP.
That's actually quite cheerful for Chaz.
And some of, and of course, and I think the point that, a lot of the economic juice of this 12-nation deal is coming from Japan. Of course, they're the third biggest economy in the world. But the fact is that despite all the good feelings and cheer we have around this room, we've never been able to negotiate a bilateral agreement. And through this structure, we now have a trade agreement. We have a trade agreement with 5 countries that we did not have a trade agreement with before. So I think the notion that much of the economic oomph and benefit is coming from one party, I'm not sure is all that interesting. You could also say much of the benefit as it relates to environmental and labor standards are coming from other parties. And that, I think, is the beauty of this agreement, is that it not only addresses fundamentally important economic issues that are going to be so important for the growth of this nation going forward, but is really a comprehensive, best-in-class 21st century agreement like we've never seen before. So I was in the deal business for 30 years before doing this. And of course, in any deal, you have compromises and you have a negotiation. And nobody gets their Christmas wish list of everything you might have imagined you would have received, because then the 11 other parties that you're negotiating with, of course, would never have signed on to it. And so I think that is a unrealistic and in some ways naive view about what could have been accomplished in any agreement that looks like this. And the fact is, it's been 20 years, as you pointed out, since we've negotiated the WTO, and the world has changed pretty dramatically. We were talking about some of the changes in technology. I mean, for crying out loud, a lot of the protections that we have around technology and innovation in this agreement were for industries that didn't even exist at the moment. And so I think for that reason, hopefully, the debate is going to be much more about what will the world look like without TPP, as opposed to what might TPP have been slightly better at. I think every single industry in the United States, every single country that is a signatory to this agreement is going to be demonstrably better off if it gets done than if it doesn't get done. And it would be a real crying shame if that did not happen.
Yeah, and I think, by the way, it is useful to put it in perspective. Because when those last big deals were struck, and the last big deals, both NAFTA and the Uruguay round, were actually moved into position in the George H.W. Bush administration, finalized in the first years of the Clinton administration, Bill Clinton was elected 1 year after the establishment of the World Wide Web. So it was 1 year after that. I was the first person in a job like yours to ask for a laptop. These things didn't exist. We didn't actually have them. And at the time that we were in office, when we were dealing with those deals, the big debate and the big focal point of the International Trade Administration was Japan autos,
Great.
Fighting with Japan. And there was no chance that there would be a trade deal with Japan.
That's right.
Of this sort. And here in the middle of this, you have the two largest market economies in the world, the number 1 and the number 3 economies in the world, entering into a deal that 20 years ago was impossible to imagine.
And let me make another point. And if you look at what this means, not just for us, but for some of our partners, including and namely Japan, it's my view that if this gets done, it's going to be so important for the reforms that Japan is looking to undertake. As you know, there's the famous 3 arrows for Abenomics. They have the fiscal arrow, the monetary stimulus arrow, but there's the structural reform arrow. And what he will be able to do because of TPP, I think will be so important for his ability to continue to counteract the deflationary environment in Japan and to grow that economy going forward. And the question is, would he have been able to do that without the halo of TPP? And the answer is maybe not. And so as a result of that, if Japan can grow their economy, boy, that will not only inure to the benefit of Japan, of course, but will inure to the benefit of its trading partners, of which the United States is obviously one of its biggest.
So I'm going to open this to questions in a second, but I want to ask one more question. The reason I do this is so you think of the question, and so we can jump right in here. But we are talking about a broader architecture. In the prior panel, there was some discussion about whether, where we go next, what happens after TPP. I just got back from Australia and part of Asia, other parts of Asia. The question was, okay, fine, TPP, now what?
Right.
And China clearly has a strategy. It's got its own deals. It did the Asian Infrastructure and Investment Bank, which between us, no one will know, but probably didn't really handle that very well. And so the question is there a next step? What should the next step be? How do we go from TPP and evolve into a kind of rules-based architecture for the region that is warranted by it being actually the center of economic gravity?
Well, that's right, and it's not just the region, of course. And I think one of the most important parts of TPP is the open architecture that was referred to in your earlier panel. And so for the ability of other economies to dock into this agreement, and I think I voted in the same way that the panelists have voted about the likelihood of potential next partners. But you've mentioned China, and obviously in the very near term, the ability for China to be a part of an agreement like TPP is going to be quite difficult on the one hand. On the other hand, if China is going to be able to reform their economy in the way that I think they will need to drive economic growth in their country and get to the new normal level of growth that President Xi has set for the country, they are going to have to do a lot of the things that might allow them in the future to get into an agreement like TPP. And so I think aspirationally, as a result of that, it's a very valuable benchmark and goalpost for all economies to get to.
Okay, questions from the floor. Surely there must be someone out there. Sheila.
Can I just sit and ask the question? I wanted to ask you about China. The previous panel discussion, we were talking about TPP, ended up being this is all about China, containing China, counterbalancing China. Help us understand what you think the future interaction between TPP and China is, and whether or not do we have it right when we're thinking about counterbalancing China, or should we be a little bit more inclusive going forward?
Well, look, I don't think this, Sheila, in my view, is one at the expense of the other, frankly. And I think it is our view generally that China's success will be the success for the global economy, and American companies will get more than their fair share in that. And so for China to be successful, they're going to have to, amongst other things, open up their markets. I happen to believe that the United States has the best goods and services of any country around the world. Second, maybe Japan, I don't know, but the United States #1. And as a result of that, if US companies are going to have access to those markets, I think they're going to get more than their fair share. And so I don't think this is one versus the other. It is not a zero-sum game. I think it's a mistake to think about it as just us versus China, but really something that expands the pie overall. Now look, there's a whole host of strategic and diplomatic reasons where I think we need to get out in front of China to set the rules of the road in trade agreements like this. Because for sure, if you look at the agreements that China is entering into with their neighboring countries, they are not the highest standards agreements and look and smell nothing like TPP. And then once you enter into those sorts of agreements, obviously incrementally getting up to a higher level is going to be a challenge. So I think there is that added benefit, but I think this is as much about growing the pie as opposed to taking something that from China.
Other questions? Somewhere behind the podium here. Oh, yes, go ahead.
You had mentioned that there was a lot of these things in the agreement that no one really knows about yet. Are there a couple that you might share with us?
I presume that's facetious. And in fact, the final text is actually is still coming together. I think a lot of the general topics, have been discussed tonight. But I think importantly, even outside of the specific, there are categories of topics that have never ever been included in trade agreements before. So whether it's around wildlife or fishing or minimum wage standards, or in Vietnam, the right to unionize. These are unbelievably important things that don't have necessarily narrow, near-term, significant GDP impact, but going to have a very important impact diplomatically and strategically for the United States and the region and the world. And I think that's really one of the beauties of this agreement, which makes it, I think, such a 21st century agreement that is so compelling.
Now, I don't want to put you in a tough spot, but I've seen the reporting during the day and yesterday. I saw Hillary Clinton's statement and so forth. Seems like there are three issues that are emerging as kind of fault line issues early on, right? One of them has to do with currency manipulation.
Yep.
One of them has to do with drug IP protection.
Yep.
And one of them has to do with state-owned enterprises. Anything you want to say about any of those?
Sure. Maybe I could just start with the drug IP issue, because that's been getting a lot of conversation. And I think I referred to this, David, earlier in the kind of complexity and difficulty of this agreement. So you have 12 countries that are in very different places in their relative development. You have very big economies like the United States and Japan. You have small economies like Brunei and New Zealand. You have developed economies like Australia, and you have less developed economies like Malaysia and Vietnam. So figuring out something that works for that collection is truly a difficult thing. There was an expression we had when we were doing multi-handed negotiations in the old days. It was called putting socks on an octopus. This is exactly what this is, okay? I guess an octopus has 8 legs, this has 12, but it's the same, I guess, generally analogy. And so as a result of that, coming out to a place that is appropriate for all of those economies is obviously going to be a very difficult thing. I believe we got to a place, by the way, in the case of 5 countries where we had no agreement with, we now have standards that definitionally are dramatically better because we had nothing before. And we have the ability to either have 8 years of data protection or 5 firm years, plus the ability to top up through other incentives that should get us to that 8 years of protection on IP. We had the currency fight this summer around TPP. There's going to be a side agreement with currency that Treasury reports they're making significant progress on. So we'll wait to see that. And in SOEs, there's some very interesting language, and again, not something that is historically historically existed in trade agreements where we've got very specific language around transparency and disclosure of information about SOEs to help ensure their compliance in the agreement going forward. One particular thing is interesting in some of these economies is that SOEs often have overlap with the regulators that are responsible for them. And so one of the things we've done is we've ensured the independence of regulators from the SOEs themselves. So lots of very detailed and specific proposals. But again, this is all new.
Over here.
Josh Walker, German Marshall Fund. Can you talk about, given that we're talking about the U.S.-Japan relationship, commercial diplomacy? In some ways, the Japanese were the first to kind of use commercial diplomacy. And specifically, can we talk about an area that the U.S. and Japan have a lot to cooperate on, India, given the trilateral cooperation we're seeing?
Sure. Let me just start out by saying, not just because we're joined by the ambassador, the partnership that we had with Japan in this agreement was really extraordinary. And I know from talking to our teams and the teams at USTR and our negotiators, it really was an example of working together to achieve our common goals. And I know we are very appreciative of the hard work that they did, not just to make some of the difficult decisions they had to make as it relates to their own economy, but to bring along other folks that we're negotiating with and acting like such partners. As it relates to commercial diplomacy, I mean, I think that's why David kind of linked the economic conversation with the strategic and military conversation. I think, Josh, we've talked about this in the past. I think the Secretary and I are firmly of the view, and this is a perfect example of it, which is to the extent that we are better aligned commercially and economically with other countries, that will for sure only help to advance our strategic and diplomatic interests. And if I could say one thing about, there's a lot of, as I've learned after 15, 16 months, a lot of buzzwords and acronyms in Washington, but there has been this focus in the administration of the rebalance towards Asia. And it does strike me that TPP is in fact the economic and commercial manifestation of that rebalance. And as a result of that, I think fundamentally in many respects will be the centerpiece. And from that, there'll be a whole host of other things that will come from it in the ways that I think were alluded to earlier.
Yeah, it's a really important point because it tends to be in Washington, the economic people are siloed from the security people. The discussions take place separately. But in real life, they're inextricably linked to one another. And so every step forward or backwards in either area has a consequence. Is there one last quick question? Yes, over here.
Hi, I'm Nancy Snow from Kyoto University of Foreign Studies. In all of this discussion tonight, I'd like to know how TPP is going to make us better human beings, better in our global engagement, beyond just the commercial enterprise here. You talked about the need for public information now and public relations. I think where TPP has failed a bit is in educating the public about the value that it has to the people beyond just the consumer and how it's good for corporations. Thank you.
Well, I referred to that, I think at least in part, on my comments on labor rights and environmental standards. And so I don't know if this makes people better people, but prohibitions on child labor and forced labor probably makes you better. Around employment discrimination, I think at least in our country makes you better. Setting up minimum wages around the world, while we don't dictate what that wage will be, every country that's a signatory to TPP will have to have a minimum wage and have occupational safety and health standards. Those to me are pretty important things in terms of doing the right things as global citizens. And on the environment, I think I would say exactly the same thing. There is specific language that prohibits fisheries from subsidizing operations that harm fish populations. There is more enforcement in this agreement than any environmental standards in any trade agreement, of bilateral or otherwise ever. And there are provisions that require protecting the ozone by implementing the Montreal Protocol. So I think forgetting about a lot of the economic hoo-ha, if we just stopped there, we'd say, boy, that's a pretty impressive thing that we were able to get across the table with 11 other countries that are not always aligned with us on all of those topics based on where they are economically and their relative development. And I really do want to compliment our negotiators and Ambassador Froman to getting us to the place where we can have the debate and have the discussion over the course of the next 90 plus days to, at least in my view, be more fully informed. There's this great expression that I love, a quotation from Benjamin Disraeli that he said, "Sunlight is the best disinfectant." And this is what I think we're hoping to see, which is bring sunlight into the text of TPP and see all the things that I've just referenced, and hopefully have all of us say, boy, I'm proud to be an American and proud to be a part of that, and really see the demonstrable positive impact it's going to have on our workers, our companies, and the globe.
By the way, not to minimize any of that, because it's all important, but we also have 12 countries reaching an agreement. You have diplomacy. You have the advancement of the rule of law. You have something raising standards from prior standards. You have an open structure in the agreement. All of these things actually contribute to the global community in some fundamental ways. We've come to the end of the time that we've got here with Stefan. I think you will agree with me that his knowledge of this and the work that's being done by him and the team on international trade and at the Commerce Department could not be more central, could not be more valuable than at a moment like this one when we have an agreement and a step forward like TPP. And I would like to ask you all to join me in thanking Stefan for a terrific job. So now for the concluding portion of the program tonight, I'd like to turn over to the podium over to somebody who I've known on and off over the course of the past couple of decades as one of the most remarkable thinkers on international affairs and global security policy, and where security policy meets the broader set of issues that there is in Washington. Admiral Dennis Blair had an extraordinarily distinguished career in the US military, rising to command the largest military command in the world at PACOM. He has had an extraordinary career subsequent to that, including as DNI. He has been serving the United States his whole life. But he's been one of those people who didn't just serve. He served by thinking, by grappling with the big issues, by challenging conventional wisdom. And he earned the enduring respect of everybody that he's dealt with during the course of his career for having precisely that kind of penetrating intellect. And that's why I think you will so enjoy hearing from Denny. And then after his remarks, he said he'd agree to take some questions, and so I'll move among you, and we'll finish up with a few questions. Please join me in welcoming Admiral Dennis Blair.
Well, thanks very much, David. My mother, if she were here, would have appreciated that introduction, but she would not have recognized it. So talking about the security architecture in the Asia-Pacific region, let's take just a few minutes to look in the rearview mirror to see where we came from in order to think about where we're going. The prior security architecture, I would say, dates from about the late 1970s when the post-colonial wars ended in Southeast Asia. It had three basic components: the security component, an economic component, and a political values component. Now, the security component was dominated by the United States, a hub-and-spoke architecture with the United States at the center, a number of allies and partners out at the end of the spokes, and maritime and air power so strong that it was never challenged. This arrangement basically served to take cross-border aggression even cross-border coercion off the table, and the United States itself was not interested in changing any borders. That was a world that I lived in. It was, to me, a great source of pride as I went out on my destroyer to see more and more big ships full of containers and cars and other cargoes, increasing numbers plying the sea lanes of Asia, both intra-Asia and between Asia and the other parts of the world. And those of us in uniform felt our job was simply to hold the ring and let the business, the commercial relations, build up and do good things for Asia. Now, the economic component consisted of an open trading system led by the United States with its large economy, but with participation by virtually all Asian countries over time except for North Korea. Developing countries could export to the US market, they could trade with each other, they could move up the manufacturing value chain, they could achieve greater prosperity for their people. And we saw many countries take this path to prosperity: Japan, Korea, the Asian tigers, and then most notably, China. I would feel this progress personally as a young naval officer. The time that my paycheck would last during port visits to Yokohama, Kaohsiung, Busan, Hong Kong, or Singapore steadily decreased over the years, and so I knew progress was occurring in these countries. Now, the political component of this architecture was a steady movement towards democratic governance, beginning with Korea, proceeding through Taiwan, making uneven but overall, I would say, positive progress in Thailand, then most recently in Indonesia and Myanmar. For years, China's development seemed like simply a supersized version of this pattern that we had seen before. And so the strategy for dealing with China was similar: maintain security against cross-border aggression, open US markets, expect democratic development. However, things simply haven't turned out that way. China has grown too powerful militarily for the United States to overmatch easily, as we did in 1996 in the Taiwan crisis. China has grown too big economically to accept all of the rules of the world economic system, has developed its own ideas for adjusting that system more for its benefit. And China has certainly strongly rejected any notion of forming a representative government to replace the authoritarian Communist Party of China regime. So our previous strategy and its comfortable expectations about China needs updating, needs changing, needs refinement. Now, the current attitude among Chinese leadership is pretty confident. Many of you know Yun Sun, the Carnegie scholar. She went to China this summer, had extensive conversations with many Chinese leaders, and reports in the Chinese foreign policy community, China's rise to supremacy is no longer subject to much debate. While few in China question that the US is still the sole world superpower, even fewer doubt that China is destined to surpass the United States. The only question is when. Therefore, the proposal to build a new model of major power relations, the heated discussion of how to avoid the Thucydides trap, in China's view, has little to do with the result of the power transition. Instead, they are focused on how to manage the process of such a transition. In other words, how to replace the United States peacefully and with minimal disturbance. However, this cocky and aggressive attitude is built on some pretty shaky assumptions, as we know. Carl Eichenberry, a careful observer of China, pointed out in an article earlier this year that China really faces monumental problems in sustaining this trajectory that it has so blazingly followed in recent years. Succeeding with the transition to market and consumer-led economic growth, announced at the third plenum, is not easy, not going smoothly. In addition to the inherent difficulty of big change, there's fierce opposition from those invested in the current system, leaders of SOEs, provincial officials, the challenge of dealing with massive debt. As the debacle of the rise and fall of the Chinese stock market showed, the habits of a command economy die hard, even when ambitions are for a market-based economy, and the result can be the worst of both worlds instead of the best. China still has another 350 million of its citizens in poverty at a time when its economic model is reducing employment. The population is aging, the workforce is shrinking. There's massive income inequality, which is a danger to a developing country with a legacy ideology of socialism. Environmental degradation is both expensive to remediate and, if unaddressed, undermines faith in the government. Loss of faith in the system, consumerism, and nationalism that is the current Chinese ideology is not satisfying. Many of us read Evan Osnos's book, and I think it captured very well the sometimes bizarre attempt of the newly prosperous young Chinese to find some sort of meaning in their lives beyond consumerism. So China is confident, assertive, but challenged and brittle. What are the United States, Japan, and China's neighbors in the region to do under these conditions? How do we form a new security architecture for the Asia-Pacific region? It's pretty clear that we are not going to talk China out of its current attitude. Only developments within China itself and actions by other countries will cause it to reevaluate its policies, to change its approach. However, the policy behind both these deeds and these words matter. We need to abandon the concept that the United States is somehow coaxing and coaching China into a responsible role in the Asia-Pacific. We need to abandon the idea that there are only two paths for China to take, either a wealthy, satisfied, benevolent China, or, which is what some people argue, or a military, powerful, and aggressive actor, as others contend. This idea of an inevitable future, one of two choices, has caused the United States and other countries dealing with China to be too forgiving on the economic front, too passive on the security front, and not really engaging with China as it is. Now, in what I'm going to prescribe, let me just say at the outset that everything that the United States does must be done in close cooperation and coordination with Japan. Again, gone are the days when the United States can make a decision here in Washington, send an envoy over to Japan, convince the Japanese of the righteousness and wisdom of our course that we're going to take, and have them join in. There has to be a much more interactive role with Japan, and that is, in fact, happening mechanically, and it's happening from a policy point of view. So I think this strategy that we work out for dealing with China must be a Japan-US policy and strategy, constantly evaluated, constantly updated, and constantly done by the both of us. So with its great size, its huge ambitions, its huge problems, China will develop in a unique way. It's not going to take one of these two Manichaean choices. We have to deal with it in those terms. It's somewhere in the center here, unique, big, something we have to deal with. We have to take advantage of the opportunities it offers for cooperation to our mutual benefit, and they are many. And we must meet the challenges it poses to our interests, and they are also many. China's future will be determined by the path and these interactions into the future, not by some sort of predetermined set of factors deeply rooted in China's history, which is going to play out no matter what anybody does. So no more new type of special great power relationship, no more special relationship between our president and their president, just business. We should continue to work with China cooperatively on the many areas in which our interests overlap, and I think in time these will dwarf rocks and shoals in the East China and the South China Seas, areas like energy security, areas like climate change, malefactors in the region like North Korea, trying to keep order in the rest of the world, peacekeeping, disaster relief, dealing with pandemics. Our interests run quite parallel in these areas, and the world's biggest economy, the world's second biggest economy, the world's third biggest economy ought to be dealing with them together. However, we cannot give China a pass on its mercantilist economic policies on the grounds that these are just growing pains that will be outgrown soon, or on the grounds that, hey, U.S. companies are making money there, which is what I often hear from my businessman friends. We have to confront China economically on individual WTO and hopefully someday TPP rule infractions, and especially on sustained egregious areas like IPR theft. As many of you know, John Huntsman and I led a commission on this subject, made some very specific recommendations, a big number of them. They were actions, they weren't words. And I was glad to see the administration give itself the authority to sanction Chinese companies or individuals that benefit from an intellectual property threat. However, the issue is far from finished, as the vote of to our earlier question replied. I don't think those of us who answered no said that it's not possible to deal with this problem. I think what we believe is it takes more than what we did. Many of us know Robert Atkinson of the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, ITIF. In a recent report on China's compliance with the WTO norms, he used a phrase that I like. He and says that the United States should move from a legalistic engagement with China to a results-oriented one. He and his co-authors call for a policy of constructive confrontation. In many ways, the specific recommendations were parallel to those in the Intellectual Property Commission that I was privileged to co-chair. Establish better U.S. government ability to track and understand the full range of China's economic actions. Right now, that capability is spread across many parts of our government, USTR, Commerce, the IC. We need to bring it together so that we really know what's going on in individual sectors of the Chinese economy and individual companies. We need to update U.S. laws and regulations so that the government can act quickly and flexibly to punish non-compliant Chinese actions and yet to permit compliant and positive Chinese actions. We need to work with international partners on this issue, chiefly Japan, but also many others. We also need to become more active and assertive in our security policies as well. We cannot simply maintain our military forces as a hedge against some sort of overt Chinese military aggression. We cannot be frozen in place by the dangers of military confrontation or even the possibility of local conflicts with China. We have to deal with the active, aggressive Chinese moves in what the Japanese call the gray zone. Chinese are asserting rights and influence in this area through a series of measures that are below the level of the use of military force, but they are at the expense of our own interests and those of our friends and allies. I completely agree with Ambassador Freeman that in cooperation with other countries in the region, the first step is diplomatic action, but more important, it needs to be a linked set of diplomatic and military actions in order to safeguard our interests. The military actions without a diplomatic and policy context are dangerous. Diplomatic actions without force behind them are feckless, and we need to put the two together, and we have in other areas, and we can. This is what we have done, in fact, with China in other areas. Back in the 1970s, we established a policy that the future of Taiwan would be determined by peaceful means. And along with Taiwan, we established a military balance that supported that policy, but it was embedded in a policy context. We have dealt with a series of Taiwan crises since those years, but because we had a firmly founded policy, because we knew what we were doing, we were able to work our way through them. In the Senkakus, the Diaoyus, Japan took the lead to establish what has become a similar sub-regional security balance. It rejected Chinese attempts to assert a claim to the islands. It established a policy of defense. It built the military capabilities to support the status quo. The United States supported it. Japanese and American combined amphibious exercises took place recently in Southern California and honed the skills necessary to defend the islands against surprise raids. Since then, the situation in the East China Sea has been relatively stable, and relations between China and Japan are slowly improving. Now, the South China Sea is a much more complicated situation, and China has a lot more room to run. But this does not mean that we cannot establish a stable situation in that region, short of China achieving its ambition of owning the entire South China Sea on the one hand, or war on the other hand. I think it's important to recognize that China is losing the important security prize in that region, a prize they had within their grasp for many years. That is, tremendous influence with the maritime Southeast Asian nations. They have sacrificed that to some minimal military gains on a few fortified islands that frankly have no military significance if serious shooting starts. However, this action is challenging two interests of all seafaring nations, the United States, Japan, others. The first is the freedom of maneuver of our naval and air forces, and the second is the principle of resisting and penalizing coercion. So we need to do several things. Again, we need to embed all of our moves into a diplomatic policy context. And so I believe that we should encourage the countries, claimant countries in the region, to solve their differences so that there is a positive territorial arrangement that we can support, not simply telling everybody to freeze in place. Now, China will not join such an agreement. They certainly won't join it immediately. They prefer the bilateral approach, and so would you if you were the biggest cat on the block. But I think this can be done in a way that would be fair to China, even without China's participation, and it would give us something to oppose and something to support. Through exercises, we need to demonstrate, not just talk about, the vulnerability of the Chinese islands that have been fortified in wartime. Just as exercise scenarios for Taiwan and the Senkakus demonstrate that the United States is prepared to deal with them, as is Japan, and to demonstrate that aggression in these subregions will not be successful. We need to conduct naval and air exercises to demonstrate the free operation of these forces. And in addition, we have to be careful, because I certainly agree with those who say that the South China Sea should not simply become a cockpit of rivalry between the United States and China. The Republic of the Philippines and Vietnam have to want it more than we do. They have to do more than hold our coat while we confront China. They need to develop and strengthen their claims, their capabilities, and then provide cooperative actions which we can support and assist. And if they do not do that, then the American interest in that part of the region is simply freedom of navigation, and we can do that with or without, with virtually any sort of territorial arrangement in that part of the world. So we need to have partners to work with. The United States helps those who help themselves. Now, what about the political ideological contest in East Asia? Frankly, I think it's not really a contest. No country wants to live as people live in China today, nor be dominated by it. We see the example of Hong Kong. We see the example of Myanmar. It may be that China can continue to be authoritarian and economically prosperous, a difficult balancing act. But that has not been the case for other countries in Asia, many of them Han Chinese majority countries. The United States does not need to crusade for democracy, but we need to promote it in an intelligent and persistent fashion, not as an American value, but as a universal aspiration. There's an Arab word for it now, dignity. There are other words for it. It simply means being in charge of your government rather than it being in charge of you. So the United States and other democracies need to continue to support democratic principles over the long term, but to do so in a smart and effective manner. This means working with countries like Myanmar, which is trying to make a transition to more representative government in a patient and long-term way. It means dealing with countries like Thailand, which have reverted from what was previously a favorable path in a long-term and patient way. So let me bring my remarks to a close and turn this into a discussion. There are too many smart people in this room to subject to a lecture. But let me quickly summarize. The traditional security architecture that underpinned the amazing development of Asia in the last half of the century is losing its effectiveness. It's out of steam. It's not relevant anymore. The combination of an open economic system, American overwhelming naval and air superiority, inevitable steady transitions to democratic governance is not producing the automatic favorable results that it did for a number of years. A more powerful, even if brittle, China is following neither of these two paths that had been on offer. It's seeking expanded power and influence by careful selection of the rules of the current economic and security structures for its own advantage. In other words, it's acting like an independent country. It seeks free investment in the United States while closely controlling it in China. It seeks patent protection in the United States while abusing it within China. It opposes naval air and operations in the EEZs off its own coast while conducting them to intimidate other countries in the region. And in response, the United States, Japan, other countries in Asia should continue to work with China on issues of common benefit that I've mentioned: energy security, containment of North Korea, climate change, peacekeeping, disaster relief, dealing with pandemics. However, on issues in which China is taking action against our interest, we must take strong and sustained action on individual issues to set limits, establish penalties, and form coalitions of those who believe as we do. Eventually, there will be a new power equilibrium in Asia as China either continues to grow, slows down because of the obstacles it faces, or even undergoes major convulsions as it has in the past. The United States and other countries, however, need to engage aggressively with the China of today on the issues of today to protect our interests over the long run, and I believe we can come to a happy ending in East Asia. So thank you very much, and let's turn it into a discussion, David.
We only have about 5-6 minutes, so because we always end on time, and we're going to keep to that here. So if you've got a quick question and a quick answer, we'll try to get a couple in.
Admiral Blair, the U.S. says it doesn't take a position on sovereignty on the South China Sea, the East China Sea. Yet it's made it clear that if there was an attack on the Senkaku, the US would come to Japan's defense. Why is the US not willing to say something similar with respect to Scarborough Shoal and some of the features in the Philippines that used to appear on American maps?
Because the issues are not as clear, because the claimant claims are more confused, and I don't think we should take a military stand on an unclear legal issue. And that's why I said we need to. I don't think we can tolerate this complete ambiguity on who owns what in the South China Sea. It's completely stymieing economic development, fisheries, hydrocarbons, environmental concerns, and it's time to sort out who owns what. It's going to be complicated. I think there would have to be joint development areas in which profits are shared among many countries. It's hard to untangle the Spratlys in particular, 100 features, all of them intertwined, some occupied by some countries, some occupied by another. But until we make an effort to sort out who owns what, and again, China owning everything is not an acceptable answer. It's hard to know which actions to support, which actions to oppose, and I think we need that framework in order to take our diplomatic actions. So I don't think we ought to make unilateral declarations about this. I think it ought to be a multilateral process.
Okay, another question from somebody else on something else. You want to talk for a second about the changes in Japan's military stance and what you think that bodes for the region?
Yeah, I mean, you know you've become a Japanologist when you think what happened is a really big deal. The action that Japan has taken has been a small but positive step on a very long road in a positive direction. I think the process that Japan went through for the Abe government to achieve approval of these things legislatively is pretty indicative. Wasn't easy. There wasn't wild applause. There was rushing of the speaker in the Diet. There were riots in the street, protests in the street. There were constitutional scholars. I mean, this is not a country that is nailing the chrysanthemums back on the bow of the Imperial Japanese Navy ships now. This is a country that deeply feels that a passive, defensive nature has served its interests well for 70 years and doesn't want to change it. So I would emphasize that that it is a gradual step, and it certainly does not pose a threat to either Republic of Korea or China. On the other hand, I think it is a move on the way towards this more equal alliance that most of us who have dealt with Japan over the years seek, that Ambassador Freeman mentioned, and I think that kind of an agreement is best done slowly and carefully.
Okay. One last question. Oh, there's one over here. So we'll go to this. This will be the last question, the last answer.
Hi, Denny. Bruce McDonald, U.S. Institute of Peace and Johns Hopkins SAIS. Not a big surprise to most people in this audience that the recent constitutional changes in Japan have caused at least a little bit of uneasiness, shall we say, in China. Do you have any suggestions for how to manage that uneasiness and deal with it in a way that that doesn't undercut, I think, the positive gains that Japan has made? Any specific suggestions?
Yeah, I mean, I hope the Chinese intelligence reports to their bosses in Beijing are realistic. Japan's increase in its military budget has been quite modest. The practical effects of the changes that we just talked about are relatively incremental. So that I think that China ought to lie down under a tree and let the fit pass for a while here when it comes to hyperventilating over Japanese area. The Japanese very much would like to work with China on many of these issues that I talked about, and I think it's in their interest to do so. The Pacific is there's a sea of fire going through East Asia, Western Pacific, but there's also a sea of unresolved island issues, right? From the Northern Territories right on down through the Gulf of Thailand. So, Japanese disputes over the Senkaku's Diaoyus are just part of a whole fabric there that is going to have to be worked out by the countries concerned over time in a way that is a compromise value. And if you can sort of over time drain the nationalist emotion out of them and look at the benefits of imaginative joint solutions, I think we can get somewhere. That time is not now, but the best we can do for a moment is hold the ring until that time arrives.
Okay. Thank you very much, Denny. So, thank you very much, Denny. You know, one thing strikes me about listening to this conversation tonight. It reminds me of the conversation I had in Australia and elsewhere in Asia a couple of weeks ago. It reminds me of it because Syria, Iraq, the Iran deal, Russia, Crimea did not come up. When I go to Asia, they don't have the same conversations we're having every day here in Washington. They're not focused on the same things. They are looking out to the future, and they're not thinking of pivots. What they're thinking of is history, and that the center of economic and political gravity of the world travel together. They are traveling across the Pacific. It is irreversible. It is a fact, and we all must adjust to it. I think what is particularly heartening, although we have cited a series of issues that are challenging, whether it's the island issues or the rebalancing of military power or China having a strategy and the US and our allies still in a formative stage with regard to a strategy not for countering or containing China, but for providing stability and balance in the region. Despite all of these things, what are we talking about in this, the most important region of the 21st century? We're talking about TPP. We're talking about a trade agreement. We're talking about nuanced, balanced roles between these various states. We are talking about cooperation and collaboration, and as Denny said, about business, about integration taking place at many levels, the level that Stefan is working on when he is going back and forth. And that's quite promising, because if this region is the future for all the challenge that it faces, there are very positive steps that are taking place. And when the ambassador spoke at the beginning, he spoke of TPP, he spoke of issues of the moment. He also spoke of this being 70 years after the conclusion of the Second World War. And think how far we have moved. Think how far we have moved in the past 25 years. Think of where we are in all of that. And I think that's what makes this conversation so energizing. And we hope that we will be able to continue conversations like this going forward, hopefully at a high level with these kind of people. Over the next couple of weeks and months, by the way, we at FP are doing a whole series of events. We have our Diplomat of the Year event, which we're honoring Secretary Kerry and Secretary Pritzker also on the 20th of October. We are doing a big event on demographics in November. And then we are doing our Global Thinkers event, our Transformational Trends event that we do at State Department every year in December, our Peace Game event that we do in the Middle East every year in January. We really have a rich array of these things because foreign policy, ultimately, 45 years into its life, is about bringing together smart people to discuss the most important issues of the day in a way that makes a difference for the outcomes. That's what this meeting is about. And that's why it is so wonderful that we had the panel that we had here, the chance to talk to Stefan, the chance to hear from Admiral Blair, and that's why I am so grateful to the Embassy of Japan and to Ambassador Sasai for helping to make this possible, supporting it, helping to create it. They played a huge role in conceiving of the social media components of this thing and the focus. It was a great collaboration. The theme of this evening is collaboration. And so I think that that's the right place to stop. Please join me in one last round of applause for the speakers and one last round of thanks for the Embassy of Japan for helping to make this possible.